and she hasn't replied. So I think we have to just hope she joins. Okay, are you guys good to go? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. I will give colleagues maybe 1 or 2 minutes to join, and then we'll get started. Hi again, everyone. We'll just wait 1 more minute. Thank you for your patience while we just sort out one technical issue. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We are just trying to sort out the simultaneous interpretation. It will hopefully become live soon, but in the interest of time, in the meantime, I will just get us started, and I'll be sure to notify when simultaneous interpretation has become available. But for now, please let me quickly mention that this is being recorded, and we are also live streaming on YouTube. And I just got the notification that simultaneous interpretation is now available. If you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a small icon in the shape of a globe, and you can choose your language, either Arabic or English. And with that, I would like to officially welcome everyone to this virtual event on the ending of the mandate of the UN investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh/ISIL, also known as UNITAD. My name is Jahan Pitalwala. I'm a research and advocacy officer at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, based in New York City, and I will be your moderator today. Today's event is hosted by the Coalition for Just Reparations, together with Yazda, the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Following the horrific atrocities that were perpetrated in Iraq by ISIL from 2014 to 2017, including likely genocide and likely crimes against humanity, the international community responded to a call by the government of Iraq to assist in ensuring that ISIL members are held accountable for these crimes. Last year, the government of Iraq sent a request to the UN Security Council that the mandate of UNITAD not be renewed following September 2024, which is around the corner. Through a series of interventions today by some incredible experts, we are going to provide a comprehensive overview of the wind down of UNITAD's mandate, contextualize its consequences within Iraq's landscape and the situation of survivors of ISIL crimes, as well as outline some important and critical next steps. Before we begin, I want to quickly mention that today's event coincides with the EU Day Against Impunity for Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity, and War Crimes, and this is particularly fitting given the theme of the discussion that we're going to have today. So with that, it is my pleasure to pass the floor to Baroness Helena Kennedy, who's a distinguished British barrister, human rights advocate, and member of the House of Lords, renowned for her expertise in human rights law and gender equality and civil liberties. And Baroness Kennedy has contributed significantly to legal reform and social justice through her work on various high-profile cases and as a vocal advocate for marginalized communities. We're so honored to have her here with us today. Baroness Kennedy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jaheen. Can I just say what a real honor it is to be asked to take part in this session. And although I won't be able to stay for the whole of it because I'm here, I'm actually in Romania attending another conference where I'm speaking. And so I can't give you the whole of the session's time. But I'm thrilled to be with you and to be with others on this panel who are very distinguished, all of them, and will give a very good account of the horrors that had taken place at the hands of ISIL in that period that has just been described by Jahan. There were grave abuses of international human rights law and international criminal law and international humanitarian law. I mean, these were war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide. And I am one of the people who was of a view that what was taking place was a genocide. The liberation of large areas of Iraq from the control of ISIL, as you remember the context was that there was a civil war taking place in Syria, into which Russia took part too. There was the engagement also of Turkey and the Kurds in that long ongoing conflict. There also were the militias, which had been created in Iraq after the departure of American and British forces. And so that whole sort of turmoil gave an opportunity, and it was opportunistic indeed, for the creation, for a jihadist movement to seek to create an Islamic State in this region. But it came to an end, and it exposed the many crimes that had been experienced by people in the region, but most particularly by the Yazidis. The haunting images of the crimes committed against the Yazidis, which involved the enslavement and repeated rape of Yazidi women and girls, the beheading and slaughter of men and boys, and the burning of people, will remain with all of us, I'm sure, who were around and watching at that time. The witness testimony revealed many horrifying abuses committed against the populations that were under ISIL control. And I've just mentioned a whole set of them. To this day, over 2,600 Yazidi women and children are missing. I've been out to the camps, the refugee camps, met with many of the Yazidi women who had horrifying experiences and heard testimony with them myself of their experiences. I did that some years back, 5 years ago now. And I've also heard testimonies about the horror of women leaving behind their children because they were girls. They were only 15 and 14 and were impregnated and had babies, and then were in camps in Syria after ISIL had been routed, and they had the chance to go back to their own families in northern Iraq, but many of them had to make decisions about not bringing their children because there was still a failure to recognize, and the families found it very hard to acknowledge children who were born of those who had destroyed so many of their people. And so the stories that one has heard in the testimonies are absolutely horrifying. But in order to deliver justice and accountability, evidence seriously had to be collected, and in a way that, of course, was not just hearsay and was of the proper evidential standards and reaching thresholds that we would recognize as acceptable in a court. And that is precisely why the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, by ISIL, was created, namely UNITAD. And after the government of Iraq called upon the international community to assist in ensuring that ISIL members were held accountable, a UN resolution was passed, 2379, and that was in 2017, and it established UNITAD to be an impartial, independent, and credible body. And so it should be horrifying to all of us to find that now it is being dismantled, and yet the securing of justice has not taken place. But that body of material which exists and is held, that archive of testimonies, is so vitally important. The volumes of evidence, including evidence from different organizations and people on the ground with the intimacy with this community, were able to ensure that the stories were recorded, the pain and suffering not forgotten. And also that at someday perpetrators will face courts and that there might be justice. So this news about ending UNITAD has been shocking to all of us who've been in any way involved, but even to outsiders who just know that justice that doesn't take place haunts generations for many decades to come. It lives on. And it really is regressive for us to be seeing the dismantling of UNITAD. It also destroys trust people have in systems and in institutions, and it really lays a terrible burden on communities that are trying to rebuild after conflict. So we're very concerned about the consequences of this at the International Bar Association, where I run the Institute of Human Rights. And as reflected in the Coalition for Just Reparations report, there are several concerns which will be further developed now in this discussion. Firstly, how does one confront the closure of UNITAD? It sends negative messages to survivors who had hoped that there would be justice in the end. And the lack of response from the Iraqi government when the genocide was being committed suggests that the Iraqi government may not commit to holding those responsible for committing atrocity crimes to account. They've been very poor at dealing with the rapes, particularly. The situation of the women has not been very well addressed by the Iraqi government or the Iraqi criminal justice system. And so it leads to the question is, will ISIL members be held accountable? And I'm afraid that I have serious reservations about whether that's going to be possible if Iraq is in the driving seat. Secondly, Iraq is not prepared to start prosecution of core international crimes for which the UNITAD collected evidence. Indeed, to this day, the Iraqi Penal Code does not criminalize genocide. It doesn't criminalize some of the other crimes that we would want to see being addressed. And thirdly, Iraq has yet to comply with international law and UN principles. And UNITAD may not be able to hand over to Iraq much of the evidence that it has collected because the Iraqi system of justice does not conform to the high standards of human rights and humanitarian law and so on that we would all be expecting to see. And fourthly, UNITAD has not completed its work, completing investigations, publishing a comprehensive report on ISIL crimes, finalising the excavation of mass graves, supporting Iraq to strengthen their own court and judicial system. That work has not been completed. And specific concerns we have is about the sharing of evidence collected by UNITAD with the Iraqi authorities. There are inadequate safeguards to ensure evidence is stored, preserved, and managed in a confidential manner. And for women particularly, that is going to be really important when it's about sexual violation. So we have very real concern about the ways in which this will work. The ways in which, I've been working recently with women parliamentarians in the MENA region, and speaking to women who are in the parliament in Iraq, because when it was constituted after the invasion and so on, and a new government established with a new constitution, it was, there was a demand that there should be women in the parliament, and there's a certain commitment to a proportion of women in there. But I'm afraid that the women are not listened to. When they try to raise suggestions of having laws on domestic violence, that there are proper laws on addressing sexual violence, that they meet with resistance, a very strong resistance. There's still no law to deal with domestic violence, and the woman parliamentarian who addressed our cohort on this spoke about how the men stand up and laugh and jeer when it's raised and say that women need to be controlled and kept in their place and so on. And so the idea that we're going to see justice, particularly for the women in this system, is not something we can be in any way confident of. So the presence of UNITAD gave the international community and the victims of atrocity crimes and their families hope and reassurance that justice would be served. The closure has taken away this hope, and we must do everything possible to renew this work. And I don't think that, the answer is not going to be, I'm afraid, leaving it with Iraq, and we have to be arguing for some other kind of international body to be created. So those are the words I want to leave you with. I hope that you will have fruitful discussions about this, but it's something that I personally take very seriously. If you spend time with victims, as all of you know, and sit with them and share and hear of their pain, of the hole in their hearts, because they don't feel that there's justice on offer. The only way you can address that, and not to let it feed into future generations and to undermine community cohesion and so forth, the only way that you can do that is by providing some kind of justice. And we have to make our voices heard in demanding that for the Yazidi people.
Thank you so much, Baroness Kennedy, for setting us up in such a strong and powerful way. I think all of your words really resonated with all of the experts that are here, and I'm sure with the audience as well. So thank you very much for your time and for framing our discussion so powerfully. And with that, I think all the points that Baroness Kennedy has raised lead us really well into our next speaker, which is Mr. Hassan Jamil, who is the Criminal Justice Working Group focal point at the Coalition for Just Reparations and a dedicated legal professional and humanitarian advocate based in Iraq. So Hassan will present some findings from the coalition, and Hassan, the floor is yours.
About to take place, to express the concerns, to express our findings, to be the voices of those who cannot speak up for this. As you may already know, following the Iraqi government's request to the UN Security Council to terminate UNITAD's mandate on September 17th, 2024, the C4JR, representing civil society organizations focused on criminal accountability, reparations, and transitional justice, expressed concerns about the very quick and unstudied decision that made without any consultation with whoever is really concerned about this, with directly affected survivors and also with civil society organizations. In the upcoming period, C4JR was responsible. We, as the coalition, we mobilized quickly and organized virtual and also in-person consultations with C4JR members and also survivors networks. Consultations were supported by international experts on criminal law and reparations. Before anything takes place, surveys were sent to all C4JR members in order to understand their position and the situation on how to move forward as the coalition and as the voice of the community. Results of the surveys served as a platform for an in-person consultation in Erbil that took place. Parallelly, C4JR conducted consultations with survivor groups such as Hope Givers, Survivors Voices Network, and also Yazidi Survivors Network, as well as females of victims of ISIS committed spiker massacres. Finally, and as a result of all these consultations, a final reflecting the views of all involved, incorporated, and was made into a report that was shared with UN Official of Legal Affairs and UNITAD itself. However, I'm going to talk about the report and the concerns that we have had in a short manner. The first concern that we have as the coalition and as the civil society organizations is that the decision of terminating UNITAD and also United Nations Security Council saying okay to this let down the expectation of survivors, because survivors had the expectations that UNITAD, representing UN, representing international community, will serve as a way out of the justice that they never saw inside of Iraq. The second concern that we have had, and those concerns, we are steps away of UNITAD getting closed. Iraqi government is looking forward of UNITAD to be terminated. UN is looking forward to just get out of Iraq, and those concerns are yet to be tackled. The second and very most important concern that we have is that Iraq as a country is not ready to prosecute the crimes, international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and also war crimes, because we don't have that embedded into our legal system. We do have a draft law that is now being reviewed by the State Council, and yet we have not seen its way to the Council of Representatives. And that's the second. And also we have another concerns that Iraq as a country, it's yet to comply with international standards, because UN representing all of its bodies, they cannot coordinate with any country that had some of the standards in its legal system, such as capital punishment. And now we are wondering why this wasn't established, why this wasn't addressed the first time UNITAD was established. Now we do have a very serious situation of all the work done by UNITAD can go in vain because Iraq is not ready to comply with international standards. And also another concern that we have had is that UNITAD has not yet completed its work. Well, according to the TUR of UNITAD, according to the roadmap they have drafted, that UNITAD, it's not yet completed its work. And Iraq is saying UNITAD has completed their work. And we as civil society organizations, we see that UNITAD, it's still there to work. We have yet thousands of testimonies to be taken, recorded, and also support needs to be provided to the Iraqi side. And also terminating UNITAD's mandate based on the roadmap that was drafted by UNITAD will be resulting in hindering the coordination with third states. This is going to work as a very, very difficult situation and a challenge, because the coordination now between UNITAD and the third states has resulted in more than 17 penalties and also more than 20 indictment able. And this coordination will stop once UNITAD mandate was terminated. And this will be a closure to a very hope and the only platform that survivors have for justice in the meantime. And also some certain concerns have been brought up, that we do know that 27 terabytes of data was delivered to Iraqi side, the Judicial Council. However, we are still looking on how these evidence was given to Iraq, and will these evidence be used actually, or will it collect dust and will not be seeing light in the future? Based on those very much real challenging concerns, we as civil society organizations, we as a Coalition for Just Reparations, that we believe we represent the civil society, we do have some concrete recommendations. The first one is that we need, and before the UNITAD going to terminate on 17th of September, we need to work on embedding the international crimes into our legal system, which means an advocacy needs to be made, because we believe that once UNITAD's mandate is terminated, there will be a very much challenging for this law to be passed in the Council of Representatives. And also, UNITAD have not completed its work, needs to agree with Iraq on how to get out. Because based on the roadmap that UNITAD says, it's not possible that we can end our work and complete it by 17th of September. We have that question on what needs to be done if the work wasn't completed. So a clear roadmap between the two needs to be made. And also clear conditions should govern the handing over evidence collected by UNITAD, because we know there are yet 13 terabytes of data needs to be handed over to Iraq. And this is not possible in the meantime, because case by case consent need to be given in order to share that. And we are not sure yet if this is going to happen anytime soon. And also the Iraqi government and the UN must agree on a legal framework enables sharing of evidence collected by UNITAD with third states. Because now if UNITAD is going to be terminated, the coordination between UNITAD and third states will not be available anymore. So this coordination will move from UNITAD to Iraq. So has Iraq committed itself to coordinate with other countries, or is it going to be just left over to the Iraqi side to decide who and which country to coordinate with? This is also a very serious challenge, because once Iraq decides to not coordinate with a specific country, the prosecution of ISIS affiliates that country does will go in vain. Another point, that when UNITAD closes, a residential mechanism should be established within the UN system. We do not, as the coalition and civil society organizations, we do not want for those evidence to be handed over to Iraq without having any extra copies with the UN, because that will be as a safeguard, as a plan B for the future use in the criminal prosecutions. Also, UNITAD should take all possible steps to ensure that evidence it has collected can be used to benefit survivors in other ways rather than criminal proceedings. Because as many of you know, that those evidence collected by UNITAD was never only for the prosecuting ISIS affiliates. It had a broader meaning to it. It had a very other usage for it. But until now, unfortunately, it has not been used neither for reparations, nor for identification of remains, or truth-telling and memorialization. All those evidence using in the criminal accountability and prosecution, it's only one use. We have many other usages of this of those data that needs to be taken into consideration now and for the future also. Purpose of these consultations and follow-up with recommendations was to offer the first-hand perspective of genuine civil society organizations and survivors networks who have a stake in Iraq and wants to see meaningful justice to be delivered for them and their country. We are convinced that many other countries are working on the criminal prosecution. However, none of these will be will give the same feeling as for justice taking place in our own country, where survivors and all those affected by that can really be satisfied of such. Until now, no matter what it's going to be done, we need justice. We need a clear path of criminal accountability inside Iraq to be able to live again with all of the affected populations. Those concerns are very much to be tackled before 17th of September. This is a short version of our report that was already shared. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jahan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hassan, for such a comprehensive overview. And I encourage all of our attendees and audience members today to visit the link that was just put in the webinar chat, because the report goes into a lot of detail and is incredibly important in terms of the concerns of the communities that C4JR consulted with, and also in terms of the recommendations. And I think Hassan has set up a perfect segue into our expert panels now, which we will move to. Before we move into the discussions between the panelists, I would like to remind our audience members that there is a Q&A, question and answer box on Zoom. So if you have any questions that you would like the panelists to answer or that you would like to raise, there will be a moment for those questions to be addressed towards the end of our time together today. So if you'd like to react to anything in real time, feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to address most of the questions towards the end of our time together. With that, I would like to pass the floor to our first expert panelist, Natia Navruzov from Yazda. She is Yazda's executive director, which is, and Yazda is a Yazidi-focused global NGO established 3 weeks after the start of ISIL genocidal campaign against the Yazidi community in Sinjar. Under Natia's wonderful leadership as a member of the Yazidi community, Yazda has collected testimonies of ISIL survivors and documented evidence from crime sites, as well as collaborated with international and national bodies, including UNITAD. So Natia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jahan, for this amazing introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today with such distinguished speakers and panelists. I want to start by highlighting the importance of today's event, not just because of the topic, but because it is the first time since the announcement of UNITAD's closure that we have in one space governmental representatives, although it is unfortunate that the Iraqi official could not join, but also representatives of affected communities, CSOs, UNITAD, and also legal experts and supporters. This discussion, in a form or another, should have happened sooner, but it is good that it is finally happening today. I believe we have all now made and accepted the fact that UNITAD is closing by September 17, but this was not the case a few months ago. The decision of UNITAD's closure came as a shock to survivors and civil society organizations serving them. We knew that UNITAD's mandate was not unlimited in time, but we hoped for a clean closure after critical milestones would have been achieved. Some of these milestones we were waiting for, and they were also mentioned by Hassan and Baroness Kennedy, are first the passage of a legislation in Iraq to criminalize core international crimes, guarantees from Iraq to follow UN standards, international law, and survivor-centered approach when carrying out prosecutions, the exhumations of all mass graves left behind by ISIS, and at minima, the conclusion of all ongoing investigative lines, including on Sinjar, Mosul, Speicher camp massacre, but also crimes suffered by other groups, such as Christians, Shabaks, Turkmens, and Kakais. UNITAD was a product of the advocacy led by survivors, especially Yazidis. So seeing it close so abruptly and without proper communication or plan is distressing to the communities we serve. UNITAD was also meant to be only a first step. We advocated for justice very early on after the start of ISIS attacks on the Yazidi community. We wanted a proper mechanism to prosecute the perpetrators. We wanted a tribunal, international or hybrid. But we were told back then that there was no appetite for that, and our calls have been ignored for almost a decade now. But the closure of UNITAD should not be perceived as the end of the quest for justice for ISIS survivors. And moving forward, we need to recenter the discussions around their needs. We have now a unique opportunity, 10 years after the start of the attacks, to reflect on what has been achieved so far and what else needs to be done. In terms of achievements, UNITAD has collected a huge amount of evidence, and I'm sure Anna will be presenting some of that. UNITAD has also ensured that exhumations progress. Only 2 days ago, the Iraqi forensic team, with the support of UNITAD, started exhumations of the Alo Antar well mass grave in Tel Afar. It is believed to be one of the biggest mass graves left behind by ISIS and in Iraq in general. We welcome this step while UNITAD is still in country and can provide expertise. Additionally, thanks to UNITAD's work, there were successful convictions of ISIS members for crimes against Yazidis in third states. In Germany alone, we witnessed 9 successful convictions, including 3 for genocide. UNITAD's work led also to the advancement of multiple investigations, and new trials will start this year in the Netherlands and in Sweden. This movement towards accountability is slow, but at the same time, we have achieved a lot, despite the absence of a global and holistic response to ISIL crimes by Iraq and by the international community. But moving forward, and with UNITAD's closure happening, we also need to face what we have not achieved yet and ensure we join forces toward these objectives. I just want to highlight three objectives that are very, very important. So, and as Hassan also already mentioned, first, the evidence collected by UNITAD needs to be secured and remain accessible after its closure. Iraq and the international community have the same objective from what we have heard over the past few months during our advocacy. Both want ISIS to be held accountable. So the evidence collected by UNITAD should not be held hostage to political games. We want the UN and Iraq to set up a mechanism which will continue the analysis of the evidence collected and also continue to process requests post 17th of September. We also want a clear plan on who will continue the exhumation processes here in Iraq, because this is something that in the consultations we have done with survivors from different communities kept coming up. Who will continue exhumations? Second, we want the reopening of the discussions on the creation of a mechanism to prosecute ISIS suspects. ISIS remains a global threat, and leaving its members, including members from over 80 countries, in camps in Syria, prisons in Iraq, or walking freely all over the globe is not a solution. We ask Iraq and the international community to take concrete steps to establish a mechanism for prosecution which could utilize the evidence that has been collected by UNITAD. Third and last objective, it is important that, and also as Hassan mentioned, that a justice avenue also becomes available for survivors in Iraq. The ongoing counterterrorism trials are not the justice that the survivors are asking for. Therefore, the passage as soon as possible in Iraq of a law to criminalize core international crimes is a must. This, plus an international law hybrid tribunal, will ensure that ISIS crimes are addressed to their full extent, and not only in a handful of trials, in a handful of countries. This will also allow Iraq to play a prominent role in shaping international criminal law. We know that this is something the Iraqi judiciary here wants, but the politicians have to follow. In parallel of the passage of the law, we need to ensure that witnesses are protected and that the trials are depoliticized. Only then will we be able to ensure safety, well-being, and effective participation of survivors. In that regard, I invite you to read the position paper published by Yazda and C4JR on how a survivor-centered ISIS mechanism in Iraq could look like. In conclusion, we need to keep hope that the process of justice will continue after September, and that UNITAD's closure is not the end, but an opportunity for reflection and renewal. CSOs present in Iraq remain mobilized to continue to support that process and to support the affected communities we serve. Again, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I really, really look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Natia, for your wonderful remarks. And thank you for your final comment reminding that the continuation of the justice process is of the utmost importance following September 17th, when UNITAD's mandate will likely wind down, and for reiterating the recommendations for member states. I think it's, and the international community, I think it's an important message that I hope everybody takes away with them after today's event. So thank you. I'd like to now pass the floor to our second panelist, Shireen Karo-Kudida. She's a member of the Yazidi Survivors Network and a member of the Survivors Voice Network. Ms. Shireen, the floor is yours. Shireen, I wonder if you can come off mute because we can't hear you. Thank you.
هسه تسمعوني؟ تمام. مرحبا جميعا، أنا اسمي شيرين، أحد الناجيات من جرائم داعش. طبعا كناجيات من المجتمع اليزيدي، من سمعنا خبر انتهاء ولاية يونيتاد في العراق، كان خبر كلش مفاجئ بالنسبة لنا، وما كان بشكل أو بطريقة رسمية أبداً. يعني سمعنا من مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي أو من بعض الأصدقاء اللي يعملون في منظمات المجتمع المدني. ولأنه فريق يونيتاد تم إنشاء هذا الفريق بطلب من مناصرة الناجيات من المجتمع اليزيدي للتحقيق في جرائم داعش وما جرى لليزيديين على أنه إبادة جماعية. فالطريقة اللي سمعنا بها أنه ولاية يونيتاد راح تنتهي أدت إلى مخاوف عديدة وتساؤلات عديدة للضحايا وأهالي الضحايا من المجتمع اليزيدي، لأنه فريق يونيتاد ما خلص كل الإجراءات التحقيقية اللي ممكن أنه يخلصها يعني بهاي الفترة القياسية، لأنه هاي إبادة جماعية وتحتاج إلى وقت طويل حتى يقدر أنه يعمل كافة التحقيقات على صعيد الإبادة الجماعية، لأنه بعد هناك الكثير من المقابر الجماعية واللي قريبة إلى سطح الأرض لم يتم فتحها وتنقيبها. هناك الكثير من الرفات التي تم انتشالها من المقابر الجماعية ولكنها لا تزال في دائرة الطب العدلي ولم يتم التعرف عليها. وكثير نقاط يعني نحن عندنا مخاوف من عندها، لأنه فريق يونيتاد تم إنشاءه على أساس التحقيق في جرائم داعش، ولكن لم تنتهي هذه التحقيقات، لأنه هناك حوالي 50 قرية ومجمع في سنجار. فريق التحقيق الدولي عمل تحقيقات على عدة قرى ومجمعات منها، ولكن لم يكمل تحقيقاته بعد. فبالنسبة للجهة الجنوبية من جبل سنجار، فريق يونيتاد عمل تحقيقات على عدة قرى ومجمعات، ولكن بالنسبة للجهة الشمالية فقط التحقيقات اللي يعني عملها يونيتاد كانت على قرية حردان اللي هي قريتي، وأيضا لم ينتهي التحقيق بعد. فهنا عندنا مخاوف أنه إذا التحقيق، لأنه ما شفنا أي تقرير من فريق يونيتاد بخصوص انتهاء التحقيق على قرية حردان والأدلة التي جمعوها، فلم يعلنوا عنها أبدا. ولهذا عندنا مخاوف أنه هاي الأدلة وين راح تروح، شنو راح يصير بهاي الأدلة، لأنه بعد غلق مكاتب فريق التحقيق في العراق، هل أنه فريق يونيتاد راح يكون عنده مكتب ثاني بأحد الدول، راح يتم فتح مكتب آخر في أحد الدول ويتم استخدام هذه الأدلة والبراهين، أو أنه سوف يتم أرشفة هذه الأدلة والبراهين وتجميدها، لأنه الحكومة العراقية تطالب بهذه الأدلة والبراهين، ولكن الناجين والناجيات عندهم مخاوف كثيرة من أنه هذه الأدلة يتم تسييسها، لأنه الحكومة العراقية لحد هذا اليوم بعد مرور 10 سنوات ما أعلنت بشكل رسمي على أنه ما جرى للإيزيديين إبادة جماعية، بالرغم من وجود فريق التحقيق وعملهم، ولكنهم أعلنوا بشكل ضمني ضمن قانون الناجيات الإيزيديات. فهل هناك خطة من قبل الحكومة العراقية بعد انتهاء ولاية يونيتاد في العراق، هل هناك أي خطة للتعامل مع هذا الملف؟ لأنه كما نعلم أنه الحكومة العراقية ليست مدربة بشكل أنها تتعامل مع ملفات إبادة جماعية، فهنا الكادر المعني بهذا الملف يجب أن يكون مدرب، يجب أن يتم بناء قدرات لهذه الفرق التي تعمل على هذا الملف. وأيضا إلى هذا اليوم الحكومة العراقية لم تخصص أي ميزانية لفتح عملية المقابر الجماعية أو لعملية التعرف على الرفات. فهنا فريق يونيتاد هم الداعم والممول لهذا الملف. هل سيتم فتح باقي المقابر الجماعية من قبل الحكومة العراقية بعد غلق هذا المكتب اللي موجود بالعراق؟ هنا عندنا كثير مخاوف وتساؤلات من إنه شنو راح يصير بعد أن يتم إنهاء فريق عمل يونيتاد في العراق.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank
شكراً
you so
جزيلاً.
much for your comments and for raising the really important questions that you mentioned, especially towards the end, about if there is a plan from the Iraqi government to, after UNITAD ends, to deal with the areas that require really specific expertise regarding genocide investigations. And thank you for re-emphasizing that this was UNITAD's added value, especially in helping uncover the truth and uncover the facts needed in order to reach justice. So thank you, Shireen, for your time and for sharing those thoughts. And now it's my pleasure to pass the floor to our next panelist, Dr. Dindar Zabari, who is a steadfast supporter of human rights and a symbol of global diplomacy, with a career that spanned many years devoted to improving conditions in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. He has been serving as the coordinator for international advocacy at the Kurdistan regional government for the past few years. And in this role, Dr. Zabari has helped shape and advance the region's human rights practices. So, Dr. Zabari, thank you for being with us today. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Majahin. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for the distinguished participants. It's a pleasure for me to be here among yourselves and of course their colleagues that we have all served and of course coordinated so far for years to bring to justice those perpetrators of ISIS crimes in Iraq. As far as Kurdistan Regional Government concerned, here at the government of the region or of KRG, we have set up a mechanism as soon as possible, as immediate as possible, following the resolution 2379. We, in the administration here, in the government, we do believe, and we still are advocating for it, that recognition of genocide against the people of Iraq, including Kurdistan region, and of course minorities and communities, must be a global strategy, not only a government strategy here in Iraq or in Erbil or in Baghdad. So we have had our own policy and of course the strategy while before the establishment of UNITAD. Back in 2014, here in Kurdistan region, a high-level committee has been set up to document and of course to gather evidences regarding the atrocities committed in this part of the country. And of course, we have also started to advocate on behalf of the components of the region, both at the international level and of course at the national level, that collection of data, evidences, and of course bringing to trials those perpetrators must be an objective and aim of the government and of course in collaboration with civil society and international partners. As is known to every one of us, liberated areas. These are the areas that ISIL had occupied and ISIL had taken over. We, in our process, have lost them, or we have paid the price, both at the level of the forces, of course, and at the level of the people of Kurdistan, and of course, in general, those we call them disputed areas. More than 1,800 Peshmerga forces have lost their lives to liberate those areas. 11,000 Peshmerga forces are injured, and they are now incapable or incapacity way in their own families. We have paid a bigger price to liberate areas, starting from Kalar, Kufi, Diyala, Salahuddin, Nainawa, all of those areas that without the presence, of course, and effort of our forces, it was impossible on ground to see that liberation so swift and of course quick. Of course, with the coalition forces and air bombardment, of course, the joint command between our allies, Western allies, leading by US, of course, UK, France, Canada, many other countries, Germany. I apologize if I cannot call all of them. Here we are in the process of evidence collection and of course, in the process of bringing capacity, and third, of course, trials. The first step from my administration was to support directly UNITAD in the effort of the collection of evidence and data. And so far we have submitted, I have to say, pre and post presence of ISIL in those areas, especially from Sinjar, Nainawa Plain, and all the way up. KRG has submitted thousands, I have to say, of information, be it videotape, be it records, be it documentation, statements, to do with all the minorities and groups and communities in those areas. So we have had an asset, and that asset has been fully collaborated and of course supported directly to UNITAD teams. We have facilitated the establishment of the two main offices of UNITAD in Erbil and Duhok. And that was again another way of support the president of UNITAD and our international experts here in the region. Beside that, we have started to negotiate with UNITAD the process of the legislation. We have had support from UNITAD in the beginning of the initiative. Karim Khan, as a special representative, special advisor, has had his support and of course conveyed the support for the establishment of a specialized court in Kurdistan region before his mandate, before his mission was over. And we have been, frankly, I have to be frank and transparent in this discussion of today, we have been disappointed with the initiative that we have started, specifically from our colleagues from UNITAD, but mainly from the special advisor, where he has given assurances in the beginning of the draft bill of the KRG that UNITAD will be of support to KRG efforts at the level of formalization of this effort. When we had the bill, and bill has been presented from the Council of Ministers in Erbil, in Kurdistan Regional Government to the Parliament, the first reading started in the Parliament. I had for 4 months as experts from UNITAD with me and participating in all the discussions. Yazda was a great partner in this, and I've had several society with us in these discussions. We included also diplomatic missions in Erbil. The idea was, frankly, we will hopefully come up with the final bill that is acceptable, first of all, to survivors, and second, to our international standards, and of course, third, to those sacrifices that the people of Kurdistan have put in. Unfortunately, the advisory opinion from Federal Supreme Court came up later on and stopped this initiative. Back at the Security Council, of course, Special Advisor from UNITAD has raised the initiative at that level, and of course, praised the initiative of KRG at the level of Security Council, supported by US mainly, of course, at the discussion. But resulted in no more effort. Advisory opinion of the court in Baghdad has stopped the effort of KRG. I wrote personally a letter to UNITAD asking for the intervention. It's time to intervene. Unfortunately, I have the letter in front of me, and the letter I received from UNITAD, still that letter is valid, that this is very much to do with the respecting of the sovereignty of the country. And this is very much in line with the sovereignty, and of course, technical support has been supported. The objective is at this, I have to say, at this stage of the work was, yes, we need to have had this legislation as soon as possible in place, because we knew by the postponement of legislation, this is what we came up with the Block 8 right now, where we have now termination of the UNITAD. And unfortunately, to domesticate the international crimes in the legislation, be it at the level of Baghdad, sovereign, let's say, at the level of federal government or regional government, it was equal partnership, equal opportunity for administration, be it at the region or at the level of Baghdad. But unfortunately, without any support internationally, our effort has been stopped, and no voices have been heard following that advisory opinion from federal court in Baghdad. The second piece of activity or work that we have been successful so far, I have to say, and to speak about it, we continued with all of that, unfortunately, disappointment. We continued to support UNITAD, and we continued to provide evidences. We also have even provided our eagerness and our readiness to support the activity here in Kurdistan. But of course, beside that, we also given Talor to have had interviews with detainees in our present situation, present detention facilities. We have also been successful enough with UNITAD in the process of archiving or digitization of documentations. So far, we have completed around 500,000 of pages at the level of the courts in Erbil, Duhok, Halabja, Germian, and of course, back in Erbil. We also have had number of capacity building and workshops conducted. But what is, frankly, from the perspective of KRG is important. Now we are the termination of the UNITAD. We also have been member in NCC, Iraqi National Coordination Committee in Baghdad. I personally represented KRG in the meetings of NCC, where we always, as KRG, have been a leading partner to support the activity of UNITAD and make sure UNITAD provide according to their resolution. Unfortunately, we have not seen some of the progress that has been achieved at the level of Baghdad in KRG. Still, I've had discussions with UNITAD colleagues and lately with Anna Lipus, where she has visited me and visited Erbil. I thank her for the visit, and of course, we have more work to do as far as we have little time in our hand. But I think still we have not received from UNITAD no reports, no analysis, and of course, no sort of feedback from the information we provided. In Baghdad, there were a share of information in Baghdad to do with Sinjar situation, Badoush prison, crimes committed against Kaki, Shabaks, crimes committed against Christians, crimes committed on sexual violence, and of course, destruction of cultural heritage. These are very important for the future, hopefully, trials in Kurdistan region. Just for information of colleagues, we also have had discussion with UNITAD to organize a coordination between judiciary in Baghdad and judiciary in Erbil to make sure possibly we will include those international crimes, maybe successfully, somehow in Erbil, according to our anti-terrorism law that is in place, because we have already put on trials throughout the last 5-6 years, thousands of, or hundreds of, if I may say, of the ISIL members on trials in Kurdistan region. And we have, as you know, we have death penalty sustained in Kurdistan region, and we have been quite happy within our legislation to bring in more, of course, of those norms and standards included. To incorporate those 2 or 3 international crimes in our local legislation, that has been an aim and objective beyond that. But UNITAD has not been a successful partner to help KRG in making sure that those 3 international crimes are included in our domestic legislation, and of course with our draft legislation that hopefully we have had by now at least few cases on trials on the international crimes. As far as decision to terminate UNITAD, of course KRG has not been consulted in that decision, or KRG has not been a key partner for the termination. The decision and the discussion purely is between UNITAD Security Council and Baghdad as a federal government. And even now, the discussion on the terms and references or whatever mechanisms of termination or Erbil is fully not included in the discussion in New York, in the discussion in Baghdad with UNITAD on those termination mechanisms. Unfortunately, what we come up right now with is a situation that we have complete internal sovereignty in Kurdistan region, and we have been the only authority that has confronted ISIL for months and of course stopped ISIL to advance and liberated those areas. But in time of the cooperation with international mechanisms, unfortunately Erbil is not included. With third state countries, we will be keen to support them, and beyond all of these, I have to say, restrictions, we will be quite happy to support the international platforms, international trials, and Erbil will continue with this because we do believe in recognition of genocide, and it has to be a recognition that is not only to help our Yazidis or any other components, it will help definitely Iraq in general, and of course Kurdistan also.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zebari, for all of your comments and for sharing the efforts that are being led by the Kurdistan Regional Government and for sharing your thoughts with us. I'd like to quickly mention before passing the floor to our next and final speaker for this section of the event, I'd like to mention that some representatives of the government of Iraq were indeed invited to speak at this event, but unfortunately were unable to attend. And with that, I would like to pass the floor to Ana Pero Lopez, the acting special advisor and head of UNITAD, who assumed her responsibilities at the beginning of April. And she brings over 20 years of experience in the field of international law, including various roles in the UN and in the government of Spain. Ana, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jahan. Dear NGO partners, dear Dr. Zebari, esteemed participants, dear colleagues, I'm very pleased to take part in this panel discussion today, and I wish to thank the Coalition for Just Reparations for this opportunity, for bringing all these persons around the table, and more generally for your tireless work in support of accountability for ISIL's international crimes committed in Iraq. I actually just came back from Erbil and the Hook, where I met some of you, actually. I met civil society organizations, affected communities, victims and survivors. I also met with Dr. Zebari. As you know, UNITAD is going indeed through challenging times. The challenges have been expressed by all those that preceded me today. We are now racing against time to organize a a plan for the orderly closure of UNITAD by 17 September of this year, following the adoption of the resolution of the Security Council in September 2023. As you know, UNITAD was established upon the request of Iraq and could only operate with the cooperation of the Iraqi authorities. Our focus right now over the next weeks is on the one hand, on the completion of as much substantive mandated activities as possible, and as I repeat, as much as possible, because indeed, as it has been highlighted by some of you, it does not mean that necessarily we will be able to complete all activities. And at the same time, we are organizing the closure and the liquidation of the team. As Natia and I think other colleagues have been mentioning earlier, we are still doing substantive work, and we just started indeed the exhumation of one of the biggest mass graves. As the time I have right now for these initial remarks is limited, I would like to focus on two specific points. The first one is that it is fundamental to ensure that the legacy of UNITAD remains and that its achievements are acknowledged and not forgotten. This legacy is not only about UNITAD, it's obviously also about the victims of ISIL crimes in Iraq and their quest for accountability. We sometimes hear, and I think I also heard it today, some narrative about the lack of concrete achievements of UNITAD. In this regard, allow me to recall UNITAD's mandate, which was to collect evidence of acts committed by ISIL in Iraq and to legally assess, using international law tools, that acts like murder, rape, torture, terrorist acts may actually amount to international crimes, in particular war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. These legal assessments, as mandated by the Security Council, are an essential part of UNITAD's legacy for the victims. It is equally important to recognize UNITAD's contribution to judicial proceedings where victims and survivors of ISIL international crimes not only got justice, but also their voices heard. Such achievements resulted, as it has also been mentioned earlier today, in indictments against ISIL perpetrators in 17 third states. And such support has been provided in close cooperation with the Iraqi judiciary. Let's also not forget the digitization and the centralization of all the evidence collected from different sources, which is a powerful tool for accountability. And beyond that, as also mentioned earlier, it's a tool for truth and for history. I also would like to refer to what could and hopefully will remain in the country after UNITAD's closure. UNITAD has been building domestic capacity over the past 6 years, which is an important part of its legacy. Whether with the judiciary or with some executive authorities, such as the Mass Graves Directorate and the Medical Legal Directorate. The same holds true for supporting the capacities of civil society organizations in several areas, in particular for the provision of psychosocial support to survivors, as well as in enhancing the documentation of some civil society organizations. As we speak, we are continuing to provide as much capacity building as possible as we are closing at the same time. This comes at the request, I insist, of a number of Iraqi authorities and civil society organizations, which remain very keen on ensuring that there is a transmission of the team's expertise to the country. My second point relates to a concern that has been expressed by most, if not all, participants before me, which relates to the importance of being guided as we close by UNITAD's legal framework, and in particular by relevant Security Council resolutions and UNITAD's terms of reference. In this regard, I would like to stress that UNITAD remains under the obligation, and I insist in line with the terms of reference and UN rules and regulations, to ensure that informed consent from all information providers is respected regarding the information that those providers have given to the team. This is done on a case-by-case basis, and it is particularly important regarding witness consent. UNITAD, as a United Nations entity, has to respect informed consent and cannot share further the information it has without such consent. This was also recalled in the report of the Secretary General that was also mentioned earlier today, the report of 15 January 2024. Allow me to conclude by saying that I count on civil society organizations' support to ensure that this UNITAD's legacy and its contribution to accountability for victims of ISIL crimes remain. Your role over the years has been paramount and it still remains fundamental. I will be happy to engage further in the discussion on these and other questions, other points that have been mentioned by other participants. Thank you very much.
Hi, I think we've just lost Jahan, so I'm going to jump in and thank you for that. Are you here still? Okay, so we were going to do, oh, hang on, she's just said, she's kicked out, so she'll come back in a sec. Okay, so I'll add her back. I think what we'll do now, we were discussing before. Oh, here she is, okay. Forget all of this. And thank you, Anna, for your comment. Okay, replace me, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm very sorry that I lost connection for a brief moment. I heard all of what Anna very wonderfully shared with us, and thank you for providing some of the really important context of UNITAD's critical work as you also try to wrap up what's been a very intensive mandate. I know that we're supposed to have some time at this moment to ask some follow-up questions to the panelists, but in the interest of time, and because we have so many already great questions and answers that have come into the Zoom chat, I would like to propose that we actually move right on to our second set of panelists who are going to provide some reactions and reflections to everything our first set of panelists raised. And then we can do a collective set of questions and answers for all of our wonderful experts who have taken the time to be with us today. So I hope that you all in the audience and all of our speakers understand that it's better for us to be efficient with our time. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome reflections and reactions and further remarks from a further 4 set of experts. The first of which will be Sarah Sambar, who is a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, investigating human rights abuses in Iraq. And she's previously worked for the ICRC in protection of civilians and open source investigations and war crimes prevention. And Sarah, we're so happy to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me well. I'll be quick in my remarks in the interest of time. I wanted to take this moment to kind of step back and contextualize this discussion a little bit broader inside Iraq. I think the other panelists did a really good job of explaining the implications of the end of UNITAD. And I wanted to sort of step back and see what that looks like in the context of other things that are happening. So I first started working in Iraq in 2018, and the difference that I've seen since then has been absolutely monumental in terms of reconstruction and increased stability, and just the general sense of safety that people feel. And this is something that's, really to be applauded and encouraged. And I also see the Iraqi government really trying to turn the page on that very violent and horrific chapter in Iraq's history. But at the same time, we can only really turn the page once the last word of the last chapter has been written. And there are several outstanding things that remain to be addressed in order to be able to do that in a way that respects the needs of survivors and ensures that, this stable period isn't just an interregnum between another cycle of violence. So there's two things that I want to highlight in that regard. The first has to do with the situation in Sinjar, where a lot of these survivors come from. The Iraqi government is currently poised to enforce a July 30 deadline to close the remaining 23 IDP camps in the KRI. Many, if most of the people living in those camps come from Sinjar, a region which is facing continued instability as multiple armed groups compete for control. Reconstruction has lagged, government service provision is minimal, inadequate, and in some cases entirely non-existent. And many IDPs that I spoke with, one of the big things that they mentioned, in addition to the lack of services and the government's failure to pay compensation to people as a barrier to their return, was simply trauma and the fact that there has not been that justice and accountability. And, we can only imagine how difficult it must be for somebody who's experienced some of the worst crimes possible to have to go back to the place where that crime has happened and know that their perpetrator is still out there, hasn't been punished, hasn't faced accountability, in addition to the fact that there's still mass graves that remain to be exhumed, all of which were things that UNITAD's work was essentially contributing to. The second thing that I want to highlight is about the other side of the coin, which is to do with Iraq's justice system. As people on this call will know, in the years following the liberation of territories held by ISIS, thousands and thousands of trials happened. And these trials were marked by serious flaws in due process. Fair trial guarantees were not respected. We had thousands of people getting convicted on the basis of mere affiliation to a terrorist group without ever being charged with actual crimes. And for people that did commit crimes, to the survivors of those crimes, affiliation is not the thing that they're seeking justice for. And on the other hand, it also means that there have been many people that have been wrongfully imprisoned. Both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have been reporting on the resumption of mass executions in Iraq, which is another particularly concerning trend, especially for UNITAD and the safeguards that have previously been mentioned in terms of sharing evidence with states that do have capital punishment. But it's also important for people that have been wrongfully convicted and making sure that only those who are truly guilty are being punished for crimes that they did indeed commit. So, yeah, there's still a long way to go before we can really say that Iraq has moved out of this sort of post-conflict period and into what I hope, and what I'm sure everybody on this call hopes, is a new era in the stability and prosperity of Iraq. But that's only going to be possible if we really truly address and take seriously the needs of survivors, the need for justice and accountability, and being able to move forward from that in a holistic way that respects the wishes of survivors. So I'll leave it on that note and hand back to Jahan.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for providing even further recommendations and really painting a clear picture of what the context is right now as we're discussing a drawdown of UNITAD, a wind down of UNITAD, and the very real risks that are present that face survivor communities and other vulnerable communities in the country. So thank you, Sarah, for those additional comments. I'd like to pass the floor now to Dr. Helena Kennedy. Dr. Ochab is a program lawyer with the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute and a co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. Dr. Ochab works on the topic of genocide with a specific focus on the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities around the world, including the Daesh genocide against those vulnerable communities in Syria and Iraq. Dr. Ochab, was such an honor to have you with us, and the floor is yours for reflections and reactions and further comments.
Thank you very much, Jahan, and a big kudos to all organizers for putting this important event together. And it was really incredible to hear all the speakers before me, and indeed incredible that we are in this situation. And Natia mentioned that it was shock and disappointment hearing about the closure of UNITAD. The same message was we heard from Shireen from the Yazidi Survivors Network. She mentioned also that there was no consultations with victim survivors. And this is something that is at a strong contrast with how UNITAD was established. It was established in response or with the very victim-centric approach. And this victim-centric approach was lost along the way. And indeed, the closure of UNITAD is precisely moving away from the victim-centric approach, forgetting about victims and focusing mostly on what Iraq wants or doesn't want in this case. So thank you very much for those important contributions. And something what Hassan mentioned as well that stayed with me is that the work is not finished. No matter what Iraq is trying to say, the work of UNITAD is not finished. A lot of testimonies have to be collected, they have to be analyzed, processed in order for them to be, so that we can actually use it to ensure justice in the future. So these are very important messages from the community that we cannot ignore. And something what also I think comes very clearly from the conversations that we had earlier today is that the closure of UNITAD is really premature, that the work is not done, no matter what others say. But also what Sarah just mentioned right now, also about the issue of sending people to Sinjar, despite the fact that the area is not safe. And without basic services there as well, really not securing the future for the community there. I think this is, again, a very important message. And those two, the closure of UNITAD and also sending people back to Sinjar without any safety, without any basic services, they aim to create a fiction that Sinjar is safe and the community is safe there. It's nothing more than just fiction. We know and we hear that from victims, survivors, we hear from the community organizations working with them that the community is not safe, their future is not secured, and we need to do more in this regard. And the last two and a half days I spent with two wonderful Yazidi human rights defenders who came to the UK to advocate on behalf of the Yazidi community. We had sessions in the UK Parliament, we had sessions with the government, with the FCDO. And during those sessions, they also raised the closure of UNITAD. They raised the closure of the camps and sending people back to Sinjar. This all was raised, and we discussed it with politicians, with officials. We received important messages of course, solidarity, but also we discussed action points. But unfortunately, as you all know, just yesterday, the Prime Minister called for general elections, which ultimately means that all those promises and action plan will not proceed. And this is not something that affects only the UK. As we know, around the world, there are many countries that have general elections this year. And again, this will affect any kind of work that those governments and parliaments will be able to do. And that also relates to the work, whether in relation to UNITAD or any other actions to address the situation of the Yazidis. So I think we need to keep that this in mind. Very difficult year to do anything. But again, action is needed. And I'll just very briefly mention a few extra comments why we need to act and address the atrocities perpetrated by Daesh. The horrific atrocities by Daesh require comprehensive responses and responses that we have not seen to date. Before I briefly discuss some of the needed responses, I wanted to emphasize one important issue that too often is neglected in our discussions around the response to the Daesh atrocities. Daesh fighters came from all over the world, thousands of them, including from Western countries, including the UK. And from the UK, we had over 900 British Daesh fighters who joined Daesh in Syria and Iraq and committed horrific atrocities there. And while their membership in Daesh as a terrorist organization is very often acknowledged, we don't necessarily acknowledge the fact that they participated in the atrocities, in the genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and this has to be acknowledged by governments. To this day, we have not seen the international community doing its part in addressing Daesh crimes, with few exceptions. And for example, we've seen wonderful investigations, prosecutions in Germany, in the Netherlands, and few other countries. But ultimately, UNITAD was the response to the crimes as far as collection, preservation, evidence, and investigations are concerned, the right response from the international community. It was led by international community. Unfortunately, of course, this work is not done. And once UNITAD was established, I was hoping that the international community would follow up with the establishment of an ad hoc tribunal for the crimes committed by Daesh, something I have been working on also with Peter Omczyk, the then Special Rapporteur on bringing Daesh to justice at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. However, there was no political will to do so, and this is also a shame. The work of UNITAD has been key to ensuring justice and accountability now and in the future. So what's next? And of course, we discussed some of the steps that need to be taken. Hassan produced a wonderful summary of the recommendations that the coalition has been working on, which is, again, something that we need to take on board. We need to hear the recommendations from the community. And this is something that also our parliaments, our governments should be calling for. But unfortunately, we have not seen any kind of acknowledgement and accommodations of those recommendations. And very briefly, one of the proposals that the Human Rights Institute of the International Bar Association has been working on is on the establishment of the international and independent mechanisms to assist in the investigation and prosecution of persons responsible for Daesh crimes since 2014 as a UN General Assembly resolution to take over from UNITAD. Something similar to IIIM as it was established for Syria, when, for example, the Security Council was unable to engage on the situation and was unable to refer the situation to the ICC. And I think, closing, of course, the work of UNITAD must continue one way or another, because without collecting the evidence now, we cannot secure justice in the future. It's very clear. And again, we need to revert back to the approach that we took at the very very beginning, the victim-centric approach, which is the only way to respond to the atrocities. I will stop here, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ochab, for those really important remarks and for reminding about the importance of a victim-centered and survivor-centered approach, which is, after all, the whole reason that UNITAD was created in the first place. And thank you for providing some concrete recommendations for what might happen afterwards in terms of the multilateral system and what the international community can do. I'd like to pass the floor next to Nicolette Waldman. Nicolette's an international lawyer and investigator specialized in human rights and international humanitarian law, and is currently a senior crisis advisor with the International's Crisis Response Program.
Great. Thank you so much, Jahan, and thank you to all the organizers. I also wanted to take this moment to thank the Coalition for Just Reparations, an organization I have so much respect for. So, as so many have eloquently set out, we are at an incredibly bleak moment in terms of justice, truth, and reparations for victims of ISIS crimes. I want to first share a few reflections on just how dire the situation is, and then end with some thoughts on how we might be able to turn this crisis into an opportunity. So first, in terms of where are we now, I want to kind of give a reality check. And like Sarah, I want to broaden the discussion and bring in a perspective that isn't always touched on in discussions focused on accountability for ISIS crimes, and that is the situation in northeast Syria. It's such an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to justice for ISIS crimes, but often Iraq
I think she's frozen.
I wonder if we've temporarily lost connection with Nicolette. I know that everyone's having some internet challenges today. Seems to be maybe the theme of our event, besides the very important topic of UNITAD. So maybe so that we make the most of our time while Nicolette reconnects, I'll ask Nadine Reiner to come in, who was going to speak at the end, but I'll invite her to come now to speak if she's able. Nadine is a lawyer at the Office of Amal Clooney, specializing in international law and human rights. And over the past years, she's been involved in some precedent-setting human rights cases, including the world's first and only trial in which ISIL members were convicted of genocide against Yazidis. So Nadine, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you so much to all the organizers of this event for providing a much needed platform for exchange on this important matter. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here today in my personal capacity and bring in my perspective based on my experience as a lawyer in Amal Clooney's legal team. As many of you know, Amal Clooney worked very closely with Yazidi survivors, including Nadia Murad and Yazda, to support the UN Security Council resolution that established UNITAD. And at that time, as we have heard today, it was clear that this evidence gathering was intended to be the first step to be followed by prosecutions in line with international standards. Since that time, our team witnessed the value of UNITAD's work firsthand. As you may also know, Amal represented Yazidi victims alongside a local co-counsel in most of the criminal proceedings against ISIS members in Germany. We know the German prosecutors coordinated closely with UNITAD to gather evidence for the successful prosecution of ISIS members, including for genocide. UNITAD also helped identify and interview key witnesses. And it's not just these German prosecutions. State authorities from 20 countries have submitted over 200 requests for assistance to UNITAD, and these numbers were only expected to grow further. As we have also heard today, no serious efforts have been made to launch international crimes prosecution against ISIS members at scale. These trials in national courts are the only pathway that survivors right now have to hold perpetrators accountable. So it was a major setback for the pursuit of accountability when the Security Council voted last year to end UNITAD's mandate, especially as it did so with no plan as to how the evidence will continue to be used for accountability purposes. From our conversations with national prosecutors, we know they are particularly concerned about their access to witnesses and coordination to get witness testimony. As we have seen in the Yazidi cases in Germany, the convictions often rest on the testimony of just one key witness or victim. Similarly, UNITAD's analytical work products have helped national prosecutors to identify perpetrators. National authorities would certainly benefit from continued access to this potentially critical evidence, considering that ISIS spanned its net globally and attracted over 40,000 people from more than 80 countries at its peak. After more than 6 years of work, an international spend of over 125 million in funding, and most importantly, after raising the hopes of survivors, there is today a real risk of UNITAD's evidence going into storage. This means that the ongoing efforts to hold ISIS members accountable for some of the gravest atrocity crimes will be significantly hindered. And it is particularly troubling that this comes at a time when ISIS influence is growing, presenting a global security threat once again. I think we all here agree that we cannot allow this to be UNITAD's legacy. And there are options to make sure that this doesn't happen. We just need states to make this a priority. From my experience working on these cases and conversations we had with survivors, I want to highlight 4 points that I would consider to be baseline in any discussions about what should happen once UNITAD's mandate ends, which echo a lot of what we've heard here today. First, UNITAD's evidence must be securely preserved in a way that it can continue to be analyzed and made accessible for future accountability purposes in legal systems that respect international standards of due process. Second, the UN and international community must finally, and I say finally, develop a long-term vision of justice for survivors of ISIS crimes, with clear guidance as to how the evidence collected by UNITAD, as well as other UN bodies, will be used to ensure the systematic prosecution of ISIS crimes at scale in fair and transparent proceedings. One way of doing so would be through a hybrid tribunal, as Nadia and Evelina mentioned, but this is not the only way. Third, it is imperative that the process of winding down UNITAD and determining the next steps takes into account the views of survivors and Iraqi civil society and is clearly communicated to them. The decision to close down UNITAD was already taken without consulting survivors. And so far, we have not seen efforts to involve civil society in discussions concerning the active repository that was proposed by the Secretary General in his January report. And this takes me to my final point. Right now, we are 4 months out from the date when UNITAD's mandate will end. But we still don't have any concrete proposals for what comes next. There are a couple of different options that have been circulating, and the most prominent being the active repository proposed by the UN, but we still don't understand the contours of this. And the Secretary General himself stated in his report that this could take many different forms. Evelina proposed another follow-up mechanism for UNITAD, created by the UN General Assembly. And another option would be to establish a single body to store and analyze evidence from terminated UN investigative bodies and courts that could then continue processing requests from national authorities and proactively assist international accountability efforts in accordance with UN standards. And this would serve a broader purpose too, because the question of how to preserve evidence and manage it once a UN body's mandate has ended is a recurring challenge. Today we're discussing UNITAD's legacy, but at some point we will face the same questions and issues in the context of IIM or the IIM. So the closure of UNITAD could actually serve as an opportunity for states to address the structural gap in the international justice architecture in an efficient and cost-effective way. But at least to my knowledge, these are still just ideas. We are still waiting for states to turn these into actual proposals, which is what will allow the sort of open-minded and constructive dialogue that is desperately needed to begin. States made a promise to ISIS survivors when they created UNITAD, and I'm hopeful that through efforts of survivors and civil society organizations like the organizations here today, states will make it a priority and the promise will not be forgotten. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nadine, for those really critical and rallying cries to decision makers and the international community. I think your reminders, I hope your reminders are poignant for everyone. And with that, I'm so happy Nicolette is back with us. Nicolette, please, the floor is yours to wrap up all of your important comments that you had started before. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jahan, and apologies. So back to the context of Northeast Syria. And I wanted to add a few points from that context. We found that there are now at least 56,000 people with perceived affiliation to ISIS held in at least 27 detention facilities and 2 detention camps, El Hol and Roj. That includes roughly 10,000 people held in detention facilities. That is mostly men and boys, and then 46,000 people held in the 2 detention camps. That's mostly women and children. Only a few thousand Syrians in the system have been charged and tried, and no foreign nationals in the system have been prosecuted for crimes committed while with ISIS. They're being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, affiliated forces, and their civilian wing. we found that people held in this system, tens of thousands of people, are facing large-scale violations. That includes mass arbitrary and indefinite detention, mass enforced disappearance, gender-based violence, unlawful killings, and systematic torture. On the last finding, we documented 51 cases of torture in detention facilities run by the SDF and affiliated forces. We found that people in these detention facilities are also dying in large numbers due to a combination of the torture they're facing and the deprivation of food, water, medical care, and other basic needs. We also found that many ISIS victims are being held in the system along with perpetrators, including scores, if not hundreds, of Yazidi survivors and many victims of trafficking by ISIS, including women and girls who were forced into marriage and boys who were forced to fight. We found that the justice system in Northeast Syria is severely marred by human rights violations. Convictions are largely based on forced confessions that are extracted by the torture that I mentioned. There are no lawyers. There are no meaningful appeals. Most appeals are a box on a one-page piece of paper that sometimes lead to further sentences and increased sentences. Just importantly, just like in Iraq, thousands of people who have been tried have been on vague counterterrorism charges, such as affiliation or membership. And just like in Iraq, not one person in this detention system has been held accountable for crimes under international law, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So consider this. The detention system in Northeast Syria is marred by these serious human rights violations. It's being supported and maintained by the US-led coalition and the US government, but that's an issue for another discussion. And then in Iraq, as Sarah set out, the detention system for people with perceived affiliation to ISIS is also marred by serious human rights violations, including the routine use of torture to extract confessions and the application of the death penalty on the basis of these confessions, a pattern which is even more concerning in light of Iraq resuming executions in the last several months, which Sarah mentioned. No one in either system has been held accountable for what are surely some of the gravest atrocity crimes of our generation. So overall, both detention systems are violating the rights not only of those held within them, but also the rights of the victims of ISIS and their family members to truth, justice, and reparations. And in this context, UNITAD is closing within months. And as set out by Hassan earlier, they haven't finished their work, and there's no real plan for what to do with the evidence they have collected. There have been several important trials for ISIS perpetrators in third states, but considering the scope and the severity of the crimes committed, the absence of true coordinated international justice for ISIS crimes is glaring. And this is nearly going into the 6th year after the territorial defeat of ISIS. This represents a colossal failure of the international community and the international justice system. What can be done in this context? We believe at Amnesty that in this crisis for international justice, there is an opportunity for reflection and action. In this case, we're calling for the UN to take a very bold and decisive action that we haven't seen from them so far, perhaps with the exception of the establishment of UNITAD and some of these mechanisms. We believe this action should come from the very top, the UN Secretary General's office. We're calling on the UN to develop a vision for justice for survivors of ISIS crimes with guidance and pathways for how the evidence gathered through its mechanisms could be used to support fair trials. As a first step, we believe the UN should lead a justice mapping process. And this process, we believe, should do 3 things. First, it should include a needs assessment of victims of the crimes committed by ISIS in Iraq and in Syria to better understand what justice and reparations survivors want to see. And this should incorporate research carried out by survivors groups, NGOs, and other actors. I wanted to mention here that Yazda is working on a very relevant study on this, which will be released in July. Second, this justice mapping process should identify gaps and opportunities to strengthen justice architecture across jurisdictions, which should include establishing processes and systems that would facilitate sharing of evidence and other relevant information for trials, such as the broad evidence preservation system, that could be used by all of the UN, some of which was discussed by Nadine. Third, this justice mapping could bring all of the relevant stakeholders together in this moment of crisis, including many of the relevant UN agencies working on this issue, and determine how the trials of those remaining can take place in a human rights compliant manner and ensure that the situation is treated as the crisis for international justice that it so clearly is. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicolette, for really providing such helpful context and also for providing really concrete recommendations as well. We have had such a rich set of panelists who have provided various different perspectives from their areas of expertise. And I hope, and I know that it has resonated with a lot of our audience members because I can see so many questions. Please keep them coming in. And I have the pleasure now to pass the floor to Alana from the Coalition for Just Reparations, who will moderate the Q&A portion of our discussion. And before we do that, I'd just like to say thank you again to our panelists for such rich remarks and looking forward to hearing more of your rich contributions through the answers. Thank you all.
Thank you. We were very optimistic with all of the speakers, but I'm going to try to bring people in now and have a bit more of an interactive discussion, if that is possible. People. Thank you, Hassan, for your overview. Thank you, Helena. Thank you, Nadine. And Nicolette, thank you for opening us to the Q&A with that kind of broader picture. If I add everybody, it might be too many, but maybe I'll add you all and then remove you as we answer. Shireen, can I add you? Okay, so thank you for starting with that kind of bigger, broader picture, because you were talking about the lack of bigger picture vision for justice. You know, of course, UNITAD was that for so many people, and now is very confusing. And we've had different responses from our different speakers today. I know Dinda Zabari was talking about how the KRG feels quite abandoned in this process. Survivors, Shireen spoke very eloquently about how they feel abandoned. And for those of us who are trying to follow the legal avenues for this, and I know Nadine and Iolina spoke so eloquently about that, it seems to make it even harder now, and we don't actually know where this evidence is going to go. I have a lot of questions on the evidence in particular. I kind of wanted to keep the broader theme of Iraqi justice just to start with, because I think it's so important to acknowledge the fact that everything is connected. You know, the Iraqis being transferred back to Iraq from Syria are also facing grievous judicial abuses, and evidence that should be being shared fairly or presented with authorities in Iraq from UNITAD's side isn't forthcoming, and it doesn't seem to be so. I wonder, Anna, if I could also add you to the Q&A if you're still here, because I have some questions for UNITAD in particular. She might go on. Okay, well, hopefully when UNITAD's here, we can move to that. Because a lot of the questions were about the lack of evidence. A couple of people saying, let me see if I can make them live. The hard drives being supplied to the Iraqi judiciary are, you know, broken or unstructured information. Hassan spoke a bit about that. The 27 terabytes of data is raw, and so it's completely unusable for the Iraqi judiciary. So I guess if it's appropriate, Anna, to direct, can I direct this question to you? Are you able to join?
I'm here. I'm hearing you, please.
Okay. Can I add you to the screen? Are you able to respond to some questions to UNITAD?
Sure. I'm on the screen. I'm not sure.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, because yours. Okay, there's a different Zoom. Okay, sorry. So my question is this: UNITAD is handing over all of this raw data to the Iraqi judiciary. What are they expected to do with it?
Thank you, Alana, for the question. I wonder if maybe the question is actually a question to be directed to the Iraqi judiciary. But from my perspective, what I can say is that UNITAD has committed to share in line with its mandate, and let me insist in line with its terms of reference that has a number of conditions related to the sharing of information, but UNITAD has committed to share as much as possible based on that information. After, obviously, the use that will be done of that information is something that is not really within our hands anymore.
So basically, you can only hand over what you can, and that the Iraqi authorities will have to pick that up. I wonder if Dr. Dinda Zabari has any thoughts or comments on the usefulness of that. I know you spoke a little bit before about you were talking about the KRG's kind of their own sort of plan beforehand with the draft bill to try and pick up some of this, to prosecute ISIL terrorists on the basis of 3 international crimes in the Kurdistan region, and then felt very abandoned by the international community, and I think even UNITAD specifically, because Karim Khan was supportive of the idea, and then kind of that's been dropped. Maybe you could just pick up on that quite quickly for listeners who maybe didn't quite understand. Is that okay, Dr. Dinda?
Yes, if I understood correctly, Alana, in KRI, in our region, the political support, as well as judiciary support, and of course, public in general, were very much supportive of the mission, and we were very much hoping that this mission will lead to, let's say, a case or a successful case in this part of the world, that it is possible with international standards. We can carry on with the trials on the basis of the international crimes. Information were ready. Experts were ready to support. UNITAD as mission had the mandate to support, and by constitution of the country, already ISIL members were put on trials in Erbil, in Kurdistan region, in the 3 provinces here. So there was little room left for Security Council support and UNITAD support to make sure that to domesticate international crimes into local legislations. I think that was a step forward if you have had supported. This was frankly a turn back from my own perspective, a colleague's perspective, a mission itself, a TUR of the mission. There is no indication in the 2379 UN resolution of Security Council that a court must be purely centralized, or there must be a centralized court in that part of the country, be it in Baghdad or Basra or other provinces. So frankly, a legal support to start trials and put up a jurisdiction, unfortunately, has sustained the whole process.
Thank you. It's interesting because your points are almost correlated with Nicolette's. You know, the issue is internal issues too. I wonder if I might be able to put a question to Natia and Shireen if she wants to join, because I appreciate you having so much time to speak. A lot of questions about the C4JR report. A couple of people say thank you, paraphrasing, but thank you for presenting the negative effects of UNITAD closure so clearly. But what's not so clear is essentially what we were kind of just discussing: why UNITAD's mandate's not being renewed. Why does the Iraqi government want to end UNITAD? It would be nice just to get some frank comments on that, if people feel happy to answer that. Maybe Sarah Sambar also. And then sort of linked to that, another question directly for Natia. Number 5, the 5th concern of the C4JR report basically says that preventing evidence sharing with third states will hinder the process, which makes sense. But this person from your question understands that the sharing of evidence with third states has already resulted in a few successful convictions. So I think what their question is getting at is kind of linked to the logic of the government. Is there now an effort by the government of Iraq to prevent the sharing of further evidence after UNITAD's closure, which is why, okay, so maybe that isn't so clear, sorry. My question is, to Natia first and then everybody, why do you think this is coming now from the government? And linked to that, is there anything that you feel can be done to safeguard lots of this evidence? Sorry, it's a bit of a question, but Natia.
Yes, that's all right. Thank you, Helena. I mean, it's a good question, right? Of the why UNITAD is being closed, and I wish someone from the Iraqi government could have been here today to discuss this, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I do think that it fits into a broader narrative of, and as also Sarah said, of Iraq trying to depict the country as being now stabilized and not needing any support, neither from UNITAD nor UNAMI. UNAMI has also been around for over 20 years and is being closed as well. This puts us minorities in a very difficult situation, because this is not, what the minorities are experiencing on a daily basis. The situation here is still very difficult. Sinjar remains unsafe. Closing the camps without any proper plan is not what people want. And justice is just a prerequisite for peace. It's as simple as that. And not having justice and having UNITAD closed is very distressing. So I think from the beginning, UNITAD's mandate was difficult, because it was setting this requirement that UNITAD, the UN and Iraq meet halfway. The UN collecting the evidence, and then Iraq taking these steps that the terms of reference very clearly lays out, passing legislation, being in line with UN principles. And I do think that UNITAD, in a way, did its best in a very difficult environment, but Iraq did not moved the process forward. KRI, as Dr. Dindar Zebari said, tried as well, but the response also needs to come from Baghdad. And I think it's very unfortunate that they are not represented today, and that we are having this conversation without them, because UNITAD is being closed, but what's next? And Baghdad needs to also explain this. I think the second question was on preventing the sharing of information with third states.
Sorry, I completely misasked it, but I think you understood the question. So
yeah. No, I think there are different points here. I do think that UNITAD was very convenient for third states who do not wish to maybe have direct mutual legal assistance with Iraq, and for different reasons. Again, not want to speak on their behalf, but there's of course the death penalty issue, some concerns about the judiciary. All of that makes that UNITAD was very, very convenient for them, and they prefer to go through UNITAD rather going to Iraq directly. And I think what Iraq is now wanting to have is that countries come to them directly, which is also understandable, right? We do understand Iraq's position on its sovereignty, and we do believe that it's always better for countries to speak to each other. But again, I think Iraq completely ignores the fact that they also need to take some steps to give reassurances to these countries, to survivors, so that the process can continue. And what is right now happening is that, and as Nadine said, we have no idea where this evidence will go, although it has been supporting many, many states. And the risk is that, and as the Secretary General report also highlighted it in January, the risk is that it ends up literally in a basement in New York without, with some access, of course, but without proper resources to handle thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence.
Yeah, thank you, Natia. I'm jumping around a little bit because I would like to bring in everybody, but I wonder, Anna, if I could ask you one more question, because essentially what you're saying is, I know we've already raised it in the various talks, but this is now a matter for the Iraqi authorities, right? They're the ones who've entered the mandate, and the evidence is what the evidence is, and if you can't share it, you can't share it. So I guess, that makes sense logically, but it just leaves a lot of holes. And I wonder if there's anything else you can add to what you think might happen. Does obviously UNITAD has the roadmap report, and we're doing, like you said, lots of capacity training with other, CSOs to try and kind of get them to the position where they can try and apply for evidence or submit and put together stuff. This time next year, what will the situation be in Iraq? Is there any sense that UNITAD is going out with a plan?
Okay, maybe two things. Thank you, Alana, for this comment. And indeed, I understand that based on the comments I have heard earlier, there's a major concern about, just to summarize with what you said at the end, where will we be in a year, let's say, from now? So, I mean, there is a part that obviously is not in UNITAD or even in the United Nations, more generally speaking, hands, which is what will happen in the country. So, as I was saying earlier, there is this mandate to share with Iraqi authorities as much as possible based on the terms of reference, which is always our legal framework. What will remain in the country, we are always, and this time as UN system, there is always a wish to provide capacity building through other means to the competent authorities in federal Iraq, in KR. We have been having discussions about this, about how the UN more broadly could support in-country after the closure of UNITAD in September. So that's one thing. The other thing is that based on the report of the Secretary General of 15 January, I understand that there is a question or a request, I would say, that is on the table of the Security Council member states, which regards the way the information that the United Nations will have, because as I was saying earlier, informed consent is the fundamental piece regarding the sharing of information. Is not the only one, is the terms of reference more in general, but which include these reference to informed consent and to the respect to UN rules, regulations, best practice, and policies. Based on that, there is this request on the table, as I was saying, of the Security Council to see if there is a way to preserve the information that the United Nations will have in a manner that would allow for a better access for future accountability processes. So these are the two, I would say, tracks.
Okay, thank you. I guess lots of questions, I should say, that are being flagged about why is there no more accountability on what UNITAD has not done, considering there was millions of pounds, and it's clearly being ended in a very unfinished state. I guess, yeah, I should ask more questions to other people. Yeah. Okay, so this is a broader question again, and it would be really nice to hear from the other women on the panel. A question from Ridhan Sheikh Dili, who says, collecting evidence statements from the complainant witnesses is obviously necessary in court. Until this moment, we have specialized courts to try ISIS. And the person who asked this question was a parliamentarian in the last session of the Council of Representatives. He says, when they legislated, the UNITAD team considered themselves to have a role in collecting evidence. And this person who asked the question says, yeah, until now, if an accused or criminal is present, he will be convicted of a crime. He's basically picking up on the points that Sarah and Nicolette made, which is the issues with the Iraqi judicial system. And I guess I wish I could ask more questions to Anna about what UNITAD has done or hasn't done in terms of promoting, better judicial processes in Iraq. Okay, so another question. I think Shireen isn't on the call. I guess actually I'm just going to ask one more because this is linked to that. This is from Lily. She says, I've been recording civilian killings in Iraq since 2003 as the main researcher of the NGO Iraq Body Count. From the 2003 invasion until ISIS in 2014, they already recorded over 140,000 civilian killings. What has the UN bodies done to provide justice and reparations for those crimes against civilians? And then, I mean, she makes the point that by addressing crimes committed after 2014, that is already an injustice. So I guess I want to actually ask this to maybe Sarah Sambar would be best placed for this, because it fits in with what we're already seeing with the UNAMI being kind of slightly pushed. Well, yeah, anyway, the question is, the ending of UNITAD sort of is also tragic because it shows that no other investigations or attempts to provide justice for thousands of other people in Iraq have been taking place. So I guess the question is, well, I'm implying a question here, but my question linked to that is, this is a real shame for the international community, right? The Iraqi government's decision to end UNITAD's mandate, UNITAD's situation, which I understand and respect why Anna is unable to answer some of these questions because they're also being forced to leave. It kind of shows the reality of justice system in Iraq quite clearly, perhaps, or maybe I should say the political situation. I wonder if you could maybe just provide some comments on Lily's points. Is there something that we could build upon, like Nicolette was suggesting, or is this really devastating for justice and Iraqis more generally?
Yeah, Lily, I saw your question, and I'm inclined to agree with you. And obviously, in a perfect world, justice would be divorced from politics in a way that was truly focused on the law and survivors and what they need and, accountability and moving forward. But of course, we don't live in a perfect world, and questions of justice are inextricably linked from politics and questions of who wields power and how they do. As Human Rights Watch, we've been working on trying to get compensation provided to people that were tortured and otherwise abused by US and coalition forces during and after the invasion. And it's been an incredibly challenging process. That in addition to people that were killed during airstrikes, the past 20 years of Iraqi history have been horrifically bloody. And what the closure of UNITAD shows us, unfortunately, is that we do live in a world where questions of politics and power often outweigh and supersede questions of justice. It's not a satisfactory answer. It's not a world that I personally, and that I'm sure many panelists and people on the call want to live on, and one that we're trying to change. But at the end of the day, it's the world that we live in and something that we will continue trying to fight to challenge.
Thank you. Can I come to Irina, Nadine, and Nicolette, and feel free to chip in. Don't feel like you have to wait for me to call you because I realise we're running a little bit over time and I haven't heard from everybody. Some questions, more specific questions that might be useful, perhaps Nadine and Irina you could take. So someone says, Iraq as a ratifying party to the Genocide Convention, surely there's responsibility to legislate criminal mechanisms to prosecute the genocide. This is something C4JR has been working on. Hassan is also on the call, so he can respond to this too. So maybe I can put this to all three of you to jump in, if you don't mind that we've gone a bit over, because this could be a more constructive approach, because essentially putting it back into the government's responsibility.
If that's okay, I would just jump very quickly.
Please.
Oh. Sorry, just from the international law perspective, just to re-emphasize, of course, that's precisely what should have happened. Iraq has an obligation to introduce effective laws that will enable prosecutions of Daesh fighters. As you know, one of the duties under the Genocide Convention is the duty to punish. And that includes introducing legislations, criminalizing genocide and ensuring effective prosecutions. And this has not happened. And I'm sure Hassan will be able to update you about any proposals that were on the table and never manifested, were never introduced. And this is a massive shame. And we heard lots of promises, but I will not comment here more. And Hassan can explain and a little bit more about the proposals that were there.
Thank you. Well, I have had this conversation with a lot of MPs judges, high officials within the government, we need to be very careful about this point. We civil society organizations are demanding the government to pass a law that prosecute ISIS affiliates with international crimes. At the same time, we are asking the prosecutions to be done according to international standards, which those 2 points, in their point of view, the way I have sensed it, they say that those 2 things are somehow contradicting each other. On the one hand, you're saying abolish the capital punishment. On the other hand, you're saying we need to add more crimes. What do you want exactly? Do you want those to be prosecuted and imposed with the harshest penalty ever, or you just want to do it according to international crimes? Well, they just see it as from one specific angle. They see a crime, they see prosecution, and they see a verdict, a capital punishment. They don't see it the way we see it. They don't see it the way that we're saying, okay, international standards do allow us to prevent this from happening in the future. They allow us to make it an international issue. They don't see it like that. I've been told, like, in the simple words, what is it exactly that you want? You have the ISIS. We are prosecuting them according to terrorism law. They are being prosecuted and they are being convicted with death penalty. What else do you want? And I'm like, it's very hard to argue this with this type of mentality. But this is as simple as that. So very much work needs to be done in capacity building to make them understand that those 2 things are not in a contradiction, and we actually do have a point of that. There is another point that there was a question that why now? Why UNITAD is going to end now? I'm sorry, just 10
No,
seconds.
it's okay. Make the point, but then also I would like people just to chip in. Don't feel shy. I mean, don't speak over everyone, but I think we should be a bit more discussive, and it would be great to hear. Sorry.
From some of the discussions with high officials within Iraq, they're saying, and already here, that UNITAD, since from its establishment, they have collected and received millions of dollars involving in political initiatives, not actually doing what their mandate was. Actually, they have done nothing that the Iraqi government can't use, and now we don't need them. Actually, we haven't. They haven't been helpful to us. We don't need them, and that's it. And I kind of guess that it was sometimes personal when they talked about UNITAD's termination. They're like, no, they are done, and that's it. I didn't know where did that came from. This is what I sensed of all those statements. Over to you. Thank you.
Just a very brief comment in relation to what Hassan said. Of course, when we are calling for criminalization of genocide, we are not calling to make sure that the punishment and is the penalty. I think those 2 have to be distinguished. Around the world, we have criminalization of the crime of genocide, and it doesn't mean death penalty. So I think it's those 2 have to be distinguished, and the abolishment of the death penalties is also key. And as you mentioned, what really needs to happen as well is a proper reform of also criminal procedures laws and ensuring the right to a fair trial in Iraq, etc. So those have to happen, and along, of course, criminalization of genocide, very key. And effective punishment doesn't mean death penalty. And if you look also at the criminal law in Iraq, for example, you have, of course, death penalty for terror-related offenses, but not, for example, for rape and sexual violence. So I think it's just the conversation about criminalization of genocide should be distinguished from the punishment for it, and conversation about death penalty, I think, again, should be distinguished from it. But this is just my brief comment. Apologies, I will have to leave very soon as well.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm sorry we're going over, so if anyone has to leave, there are just so many questions coming in. I'd quite like to ask 1 or 2 more, but if people have to go, then of course feel free. Nadine, would you like to speak? And Natia has her hand up too.
I'm afraid I have to leave, but thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you for your remarks and everything you're doing. Bye. Natia, I know you want to pick up a question. Maybe
I just wanted to very quickly, very briefly comment on the death penalty point, because this is something, that also came up a lot in the conversations we are having with survivors. And often their concern is that, what needs to be reformed is the judiciary, but also the whole prison system, because a lot of the ISIS members who enslaved them were actually previously in prisons, and they escaped for various reasons. So, that's why I think, it's so important to have a holistic approach to ISIS crimes. Reform the judiciary, reform, the prisons, and make sure that there's witness protection, make sure that there's trust built with the communities, so that these trials in a way are not just, for the security of the state, the way it is being handled now, but really have a deeper impact in the communities.
Thank you. Nicola, if you want to come in at any point, please jump in. I know Dinda is happy to answer a quick question on the camps, which I'd quite like to take if that's okay with everyone. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I haven't asked them all, but I've shared lots of them, so feel free to jump in and answer by sort of typing. I mean, they're all really great questions and they don't all have answers, so it feels quite hard to be picking them. Okay, so is someone, no, okay. A specific question that might be useful, sorry, just going to mute you, which might be really helpful very quickly. Hassan, if you could take this in 1 minute. A question about, I think you covered it, but just to clarify for a journalist with the New Arab, could it please be clarified which evidence can be shared with the Iraqi government, which evidence cannot be shared beyond the issue of informed consent, and what will now determine how the UN will handle the evidence gathered by UNITAD? How will it be achieved or managed? Well, that's rather the point, because we don't know, right? So like your guess is as good as ours, which is a problem in itself. But if you could take that in like 1 minute, then we'll go to Dinda. That would be great. Thank you.
It's somehow funny when you talk about it. Some people say, and which a major part of it is true, when UNITAD was established, Iraqi government and Judicial Council handed over some of the evidence that was already collected by Iraq to UNITAD to work on, to categorize, to just make it usable. UNITAD built on that in its future work. So now what UNITAD did is that they gave Iraq the evidence that was already given to them by the Iraqi side and said, here is the evidence, which is without the software. And I believe that without the software, it's not manageable and used. And the rest of the evidence, it's not shared with Iraq because Iraq is it's not compliance with international standards when it comes to the capital punishment, and also the case-by-case consent of the survivors not yet given to be for those evidence to be shared with the Iraqi side. So we have two types of evidence: those that Iraqi gave it to UNITAD, and also the evidence that are actually just reports that is not actually sensitive and usable information, data. And those that really matters are those evidence that are not yet handed over to Iraqi side. And we don't know what will happen to those. According to the report, I want to prolong this, but according to the report that was submitted to the Security Council, that it was suggested a repository needs to be established within the UN. We don't know what happened to that as well. So I believe the evidence that is not to be shared with Iraq, it's going to go somewhere. And that place needs to be able to improve it, analyze it for the future reference and usage.
And that's rather what Nadine was getting at as well with the repository. Dr. Dinda Zabari, if you could speak in like 1 or 2 minutes. I know it's a big question, but we had quite a few questions. I think it would be remiss not to ask you camp closures affecting a lot of displaced IDPs. July 30th, I believe, is the latest deadline. Who knows? Sorry, not to be facetious, but we don't know if camps will have to close, but the Council of Ministers have said that that's the deadline for camps to close. So if you could comment a little bit on the KRG's position on this and how it fits into the broader sort of picture of absolutely lack of justice for survivors of displacement in Iraq. I think there's just under 200,000 things. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alana. Thank you. Yes, the position of KRG has been clear throughout the last many years. We have been a region that we have hosted more than 2 million of those IDPs and refugees out of the ISIL atrocities in Syria in the beginning, and then IDPs from the provinces out of the KRG areas. By now, we have around 900,000 of those IDPs and refugees still residing in Kurdistan. 33 camps, if I'm correct, and 30% of those IDPs are resident in our camps. The biggest, I have to say, is the number of camps to do with the Yazidis, our brothers and sisters Yazidis from Sinjar and other around the surrounding areas. So the position is very clear. There is no policy in place to forcefully deport these IDPs from Kurdistan region, to do it with Yazidis or Arabs or any other communities who are residing now in Kurdistan as IDPs. Our stand with Baghdad has been very clear, and unfortunately, because of this policy that we have in place, Minister of Migration and Immigration from Baghdad stands very much opposite to the policy of KRG and accuses KRG of keeping and holding IDPs forcefully in Kurdistan region, which is nonsense. We have a president of international organizations in Kurdistan in those camps. So yes, we are clear enough on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And yet good intentions, but politically, who knows where the decisions lie in that, because I believe the court case is still to be settled, and it's just an extra level of worry and concern for survivors and their communities and the NGOs who are trying to understand what's happening, and the international community. Although it's not directly linked to UNITAD, but I guess it's all connected. Thank you for all of these questions. I guess we didn't come to any firm conclusions, but hopefully we raised lots of the problems. I wonder if anyone has something else they want to briefly add, or Natia, Nicolette, I'm sorry, didn't come to you so much. I hope I shared enough from speakers here. Like, please check out Sarah's report onto the situation in Sinjar and the closure of the displacement camps, because it ties in what Dr. Dindar Zubair was saying with the Yazidi survivors law, which I don't think we've even mentioned on the entire call, which is another important piece of legislation that C4JR is trying to advocate for. It was really great to have you all on the panel. Thank you so much for all of the questions, all of the people who are still here. I think Jahan mentioned at the beginning, but today is the EU Day Against Impunity for Genocide, Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes. And I think we can probably conclude that there is a long way to go in Iraq and Syria and lots of countries, for that matter, in this respect. But it's great to have so many people who care about these issues. And I guess if I'm drawing any conclusions from the discussion, it seems to come back to what people have raised in different ways throughout the panel, which is that this is a responsibility for sovereign governments and judiciaries. And yeah, I mean, UNITAD is going, and these answers will have to come from those in Iraq, most likely, which is complicated by the fact that we have, KRG as well. But anyway, thank you for joining. Anyone want to make a quick final remark, or are we good to wrap up? Okay. Thank you, Hassan, Nicolette, Sarah, Anna, Natia, Dr. Dindar, everyone else on the call who left, everyone who's still watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.